Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SCG Near Surface Geophysics Technical Section Student Committee Subcommittees webinar on how to apply for scholarships and grants, which is part of our webinar series on critical skills. So the SCG Near Surface Subcommittee and myself, Chinaze Mary Arukwe, will serve as your hosts for today's webinar. Before we begin, the model of this webinar will be a short presentation followed by an extended question and answer section. So during the Q&A section, if you'd like to ask questions, just please raise your hand in the webinar interface, and SCG will adjust your settings to allow you to ask your questions directly to the presenter. Alternatively, please place your questions in the Q&A box found in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen when you move your cursor over the bottom of the screen. So today's presenter is Dr. Sarah Morton Rupert. Dr. Sarah Morton Rupert is an engineering geophysicist with the Bureau of Reclamation in Denver, CO, Colorado. She specializes in near-surface seismic methods with a keen interest in subsidence and void detection. Sarah grew up between Boston, MA, and New York City, NY, and hails from the University of Connecticut, where she earned a bachelor's degree in geoscience and a master's degree in geotechnical engineering. She continued her graduate education at the University of Kansas, where she earned another master's degree in geology, geophysics, and a PhD in geotechnical engineering. Sarah has held research positions with the United States Geological Survey, the Connecticut Geological Survey, National Center for Research on Earthquake Engineering in Taiwan, US Army Corps of Engineers, and Kansas Geological Survey. Throughout her graduate study, she received 9 travel grants, 2 research grants, and 7 scholarships from 9 different institutions, in addition to her 7-year graduate research assistantship. Outside of geophysics, she's an avid runner, having completed more than 20 half marathons and 1 marathon across 18 different states. Thank you, Dr. Sarah. We are so happy to have you join us today. And the mic is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I know I wrote it, but it's nice to have it read to me. Okay, so thank you everybody for coming today. So I feel like PowerPoints are kind of a difficult way to discuss applications for research, scholarships, and grants. So I've prepared a summary PowerPoint that should maybe take like 20 to 30 minutes. And then I'm hoping to just like really open the floor for questions, because I feel like research grants are such an individual thing per person. And while we can give really broad advice to applicants and to students, it can be, I find it, at least when I was applying for grants, I found it more helpful to get direct feedback on what I was most particularly curious about. So we're just going to go over some of the things that I've learned, and then I have a couple different resources for everybody, whether they're straight off the SCG website or just other resources from other societies in the geosciences. So we'll just hop right in here. So since we're with SCG here, I figure we should talk about, at least introduce what all the different research scholarships and grants that are given out by the SCG specifically. You may already be aware of these. Hopefully you are if you're interested in applying for grants. So first and foremost is the SCG Student Scholarship Program. And I write it's by varying names, and that's just because once the grant is awarded to the student, it has a specific name, and that's usually because of whoever the person who made the donation, that is the name of the scholarship that's being received. And we'll talk more individually about each of these. But the student scholarships, I feel like, are one of the biggest goals for students, because they give the largest amount of money from SCG. So if you're in the near surface area, so there is a specific near surface research award that was established within the last 10 years. And then there's, of course, the Student Technical Program Grant, and then there are 2 other programs within the SEG, the SLS program and the SEP. Both of those are held specifically at the annual meeting every year. I won't be talking about those because they're not research related, but they are grants that are available to students who want to develop different types of skills at the annual meeting through like a 1 or 2 day workshop. So what is a research proposal? So I know when I was applying to grants and I was trying to just like formulate my own research project, I probably had a cubicle that looked like this, where I had papers everywhere, where I was just trying to figure out how to organize a research proposal, how to organize my ideas. I'd be trying to talk to so many different students, being like, this is what I want to achieve. And it seems like a really overwhelming and complicated process sometimes, because research grants are often need to be very succinct and clear, and it can sometimes feel overwhelming when you're trying to put all the pieces together and in order, and it is very much a process, but it is a learned skill. One thing one of my former advisors told me is that there's no such thing as good writing, there's just good rewriting. So that's something that I've held through every time I've written, either through papers or proposals, is that the first draft usually isn't going to be the draft that you submit. There's always going to be often several levels of rewrites that are here to just help you do better. So in general, what is a research proposal? So this is just straight off some of the other granting agencies. So hopefully you all are aware, a research proposal has a specific question that you're trying to answer. And so what goes into your proposal is sometimes it's a couple pages and sometimes it's like 15, 20 pages, depending upon how large the grant is that you're applying for. And so really the purpose of what you're putting into your proposal is to formulate a question, demonstrate the importance and the need, and then convince the granting agency why it's worth funding. And something to understand is that just because the reasons that you may think it's important for funding may not necessarily be may not be reasons why a granting agency sees that it's worth funding. And that's no offense at all to what your research ideas are. I believe that just about any question should be worth investigated. It's just a matter of the organization probably only has so much money to grant at that time. And some agencies may have specific themes or content areas that they are focused on each year. So that's something that's important to keep in mind is it's important that when you're applying to a specific grant program, that you need to make sure that your goals and your research aligns often with the mission or the goals of that society. So for like a really obvious example is, as a geophysics organization, we're probably not going to submit a research proposal to like say if it's a geophysics proposal, you may not be submitting to like a literature grant program, right? Like that's an obvious example of a misalignment. It even gets more nitty gritty. Even we all know that geoscience, although it can be wide, can also be very specific. So make sure that the granting agency also has similar goals and interests in the research that you're proposing. And something that's often overlooked in research proposals is the budget. And this is actually something that I really didn't get experience with when formulating during my degree. It came with time. And part of that was because I personally wasn't exposed to budgeting while I was early on in my graduate career, especially since I had a research assistantship throughout my degree program. I often was basically shielded from a lot of how much stuff cost, which was a very fortunate thing. It wasn't until I got later in my career where my graduate career, where I started formulating what my specific research project was going to be, that I started learning what these expenses are, what's important, and what needs to be talked about. Like maybe not a lot of things I think we think about may be overlooked. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then also some research proposals can request a figure This is very dependent on the agency, how much space is allowed, and how much money you're looking for. And I think it's also based on maybe what level or like what stage in the research process that you're in. So if you've already done some research in this area and you're looking for additional funding, or you've maybe already done like a literature review, for example, that's where you can find some a figure to support maybe the importance or demonstrate what current research looks like, and then you can talk about where you want to take the research. So that may be ways that a figure would be helpful. It's often to demonstrate the question and the pathway you're trying to go down with your proposal. So these are things that I've learned through applying to different grants. I want to emphasize that although my bio says I've received like X number of grants or whatever throughout my graduate career, what it doesn't talk about is how many grants I did not receive that I did apply to. So I feel like that's something that people don't like to talk about, is how many grants that they applied to and never received. Like, for example, I often applied to grants from the state that I was living in for graduate school, never once received one of those grants. And one of the reasons, I think, is just because the granting agency, their mission just didn't really align with what my research goals were. So for example, the state of Kansas had a keen interest in, it was often a keen interest in like oil and gas. And I was a more near surface person. So it really wasn't a suitable agency for me to even apply to. And unfortunately, it took me several years of applying to realize that, because my classmates had all been successful in securing those grants, but it's because they had different research goals than I did. So even though it was a geological foundation, this is where it becomes really important to do research on the funding agency to make sure that you actually have similarities in your research answers. So some things that are really important, if you haven't already read my slide, read the questions and the requirements very carefully. One of the easiest ways to get disqualified from a grant program is to just not submit all of the necessary requirements. This can be as simple as not submitting your transcripts. Maybe because every research grant for students often requires transcripts. Even if you submit your transcripts, make sure you have a long enough period of your transcripts to have. So for example, I know the SCG scholarships, I believe, require the last 3 years. So make sure that if you transferred universities, make sure you provide transcripts from both universities that you applied to, rather than just your current institution. If you've been there fewer years than the required number of years that they're asking for a background on. Make sure you're an active member or a due-paying member with the society that you're applying to. I'm not sure it's necessarily a requirement, and I don't think they can say it's a requirement, but I feel like it's probably helpful. And also, I feel like being a member of the society probably also means that you have some sort of idea of what the society is looking for. Something that may seem very silly is to blankly or blatantly restate parts of the questions, excuse me, in the answers. So if they say, I don't know, what motivated you to pursue this research? You could literally say, I was motivated to do this because, and like go into that sort of thing. So like I very literally restate that, because it allows you to, it helps, I believe it helps you actually make sure you are answering the questions literally and directly. Like, don't try to get creative with your writing style, like dance around the words that are used. Literally copy paste the question into your response and then rewrite it so that it's a statement now rather than a question. So don't be afraid to do that, because it honestly makes it a lot easier for people who are reviewing the applications, because it's almost like a checkbox. They're like, okay, did they answer the questions? And if they see these specific key terms that they used in the grant application, they'll be like, okay, yes, this is where I'm going to direct my eyes to, and I can make sure that the granting officer can just more easily read what you're writing. Let's see, answer questions honestly. So this might seem very silly also, but try not to fluff up or I guess elaborate or exaggerate on some of your applications. Be very specific about what the research goals that you're trying to achieve. Don't lie about what you've already done. Often people go into these research grants, maybe not really having a lot of experience, or maybe not going down the road of what they're trying to research. If you've done some research and it's been unsuccessful, you can use that as motivation for why you're trying to investigate a different type of problem or a different way of going about the problem. And so this answering honestly also goes into, I think, probably your personal statement, where you talk about who you are as a person, why you're personally interested. Like, don't be afraid to talk about what your personal motivations are. I remember I applied to an NSF grant, and it was a summer program, and you had to provide a personal statement about why you were interested in, I think it was like the geosciences and stuff like that. And so I went into detail about growing up as a kid and really being interested in rocks, and how I was really invested in earthquakes and did a lot of earthquake presentations and outreach. And so that like fed my desire to pursue research in earthquake engineering. And so those are like the types of things that are important, and just like try to be genuine and yeah, just be honest with what the questions that you're answering. Something that I think is very silly is outlines. I don't know if anyone already does this. I personally hate outlining, but I still do it because I actually do find it very helpful. So if you're able to just, even if you don't start with your outline with the beginning, I feel like the introduction is often very difficult to start with. Maybe you know exactly what your question is, but you don't know how to get there yet. So rather than having a situation like that first slide I showed with like answers and lines going all over the place, start with where you know, start with what you know, and then you can either work into it or you can work out of it. But formulating an outline, I feel, will help you create a better rounded argument, rather than just like jumping right into the research proposal and just starting to write like crazy, whatever your brain can think to. Because if you just write however your brain has information coming to you, sometimes that scatterbrainedness can become evident in the proposal that you're writing. So not only try to create like an outline, but do proofread your grants before you send them. And whether you are proofreading them or a classmate or a professor, make sure there's at least another set of eyes on these, because there are some things that are really frustrating that we'll talk about later in research grants, and there are really easy ways to get your grant proposal thrown out. And I think I've already talked about this. Refer to the organization's mission and goals in some of your answers. How does your research question help support some of the missions of the organization's own mission? What are some of the goals? Who are they trying to help? Who are they trying to serve? What sort of, if it's an energy organization, what type of areas of energy are they interested in? You can even look at what past research recipients have researched. And while I'm not saying you should copy their research, maybe see what some of their personal goals were, if that's available. Usually the abstract is at least available. You can look at to see maybe even how they formulated their abstract, or what the takeaway at the end of the day was. Because sometimes you can have a broader impact. I know that's a really common term over the last 10 years, is how your research has a broader impact. So even if it's a very specific thing that you're investigating, how does it contribute to the profession as a whole? Like, what gap are you trying to fulfill or fill in with this research question that you're looking at? And in many cases, you can reach directly out to the granting committee. I think, at least with SEG, there's often at the bottom of each page, there's a contact where you can reach out, and maybe they won't be able to give you specific or direct advice, but they may be able to provide you with some resources or just help you make sure that you have all the different components of the abstract application or the research application. Another thing, a couple other things, start the application process early. I am somebody who tends to be last minute about things, which is a really hard thing to overcome. And that's something I had to learn with these granting agencies, because it's for the student, it may be easy to just stay up all night the night before a deadline and read something over. But if you're hoping for peer review, it's important to provide people with an adequate amount of time to thoroughly and fully review your work. So here I've wrote about, like, ask for peer review, even if it's just your own classmates. That can be helpful, even if they don't maybe if you go fully technical in your abstract information, maybe having another student who's in your field, it can be helpful because they can tell you where stuff may be confusing. And it's not always necessary to go full in depth, full detail, full technical in these proposals, because you want to make sure that the folks that are reading it do have an understanding of what you're trying to do. So maybe don't go like too jargony, like a research publication, like a journal publication. Like, you want to make sure that somebody else in your field can understand what you're trying to talk about. You can even talk to students who have been successful in those grant programs, whether they're in your own research group or within your own university. Maybe within the near surface group, you can reach out to other students. If anyone here has received any of these grants, that can be really helpful to just get advice on, like, maybe what how they went about something, or even just another, like I said, another pair of eyes. And so this bottom one is kind of very specific. So maybe talk about what you appreciate about the Granting Society and how it impacts you as a member. That's not always a question. So I talked about this specifically for the SEG travel grant for when you have your when you have a paper accepted. And so I remember one year when I received the travel grant, it asked me a question about what if there was something that I would change or something I wanted to see the society do. And although it's not at all related to the paper that I submitted, it's not at all related to research, the thing that I told them I wished to see about the organization was I wished for them to expand voting rights to associate level SEG members. This seems like a very wild and off-base thing, but sometimes these granting agencies have questions about the greater society. And what was really fun about when I proposed this idea is that then that fall, associate level members were actually given voting rights. So it was I was very fortunate in the timing of my proposal. And I think that's part of the reason why I was able to receive the travel grant, because I was tuned in to the happenings and some of the topics going on within the society, that I was able to make a fairly on brand or well-timed suggestion. So that's where, like, just being a member of the society and understanding what the society is about, understanding what members want, maybe understanding what you yourself would like to see. And part of the reason I suggested associate level members get voting rights is because I felt that some of the younger folks, like myself at the time, should be able to have a say in what the society is doing and the mission. And so I think that's something we all want, is to be able to have a say and have our voice heard. So just maybe having an interest in the organization that you're applying to and what it's about can be really helpful, because research impacts all of us, and so do the societies that are providing research to all of us. So some things to avoid in your application. These may also seem very obvious, but they can be very easy to overlook. Spelling errors. It can be really easy depending upon what program you're using to write your proposal. I peer review here at my work, and even though we all use Microsoft Word, which has autocorrect and tells you when there's a spelling error, it's still very easy to just overlook those spelling errors. So having another person or even yourself rereading it can be helpful. Poor grammar and paragraph long sentences. These are things that I feel when we're typing, we may just be typing how our brain is working. But like I said, proofreading is so important. Make sure that when you reread some of the sentences that you're writing, that if you take a breath in that paragraph and there's no punctuation, insert some punctuation or break it down into multiple sentences, because it's hard to read sentences and then that are that long. And if it's hard to read it, then you're going to lose your reader and they're going to lose interest in wanting to find out what the significance of what you're writing is. So be sure to try to be effective with your punctuation. So this goes right into the second one that I talked about, lengthy responses that exceed word limits. Some places are pretty strict. I think the SEG applications, it's an online application, and so they only allow so many characters, so you can avoid having these lengthy responses. But in other societies where they say just submit a PDF, this can allows it to be longer than I think the requests. And sometimes some granting agencies are really strict about their things, and they'll just throw out applications that appear to be too long. Or they'll just stop reading where that you hit that limit, which can be really detrimental to what you're trying to convey to the granting agency. They don't read like the last third of your research proposal, for example. Try to avoid criticizing or speaking poorly about the organization. So this goes back to one of the things you can talk about is like how the society impacts you, maybe broader impact. Just try to be sure that when you're trying to convey to the reader why this is important, why your research is important, try to avoid putting down other research or putting down other projects or and such like that. Just try to go about it in a maybe benefit of the doubt, or just talk about why you feel this is significant without hurting others in the process. And then this kind of talks about earlier, don't try to cram too much information into the proposal. So even if you have say you have a 2,000 word limit, if you try to look for a balance between demonstrating the knowledge that you have and the question that you're trying to answer. So make sure like upfront you state what your question is, and then go through the logistics of how you plan to work through that, solving that question. And then maybe even talk about what you hope to achieve with the process. Don't spend an over amount of time on just trying to demonstrate to the reader or to the reviewer your level of knowledge, which would leave less time for you to talk about what the information is, like what research question you're trying to achieve. Try to find that good balance almost between literature review, even though I don't think SEG grants require a literature review, but in some of those longer proposals, like an NSF grant, for example, you may have to conduct a literature review. Just try to make sure you don't lose your reader in your attempt to let them know how well versed you are in your research. Because it's very difficult to work through like a long introduction, for example, without finding out what even the purpose of the research is. So be sure you're upfront about what the research topic that you're trying to investigate, provide supporting information as needed, but be clear and succinct as possible, which I recognize is easier said than done, but we all are doing our best with our writing. Writing is such a hard skill to be effective at. So again, like my advisor said, there's no such thing as good writing, just good rewriting. And we all got to keep an open mind with our rewriting and being open to that criticism. Okay, so talk a little bit about each of the different grants that SEG offers. So the SEG scholarships offer anywhere from $500 to, I believe, $10,000, which is pretty incredible. And so these are just the requirements straight off of the website. So the application process is going to open in November, and students from all over the world can receive these grants, which is a really incredible thing. One of my favorite things is seeing students on LinkedIn posting about what scholarships they've received from SEG that year in so many different range of amounts. I believe the website said that the current average amount is $4,300 US. which is a huge grant to receive. Really simple here, just make sure you meet all of these different requirements. Make sure you include your transcripts. Make sure you have your 2 faculty recommendations. Make sure you submit your application online. Don't wait until the minutes before the deadline to submit it, because you never know what could happen, because you could have your internet go out, your battery on your laptop could die, your the website could be so overloaded that that it's like crashing and you're having a difficult time just loading the web page. That happens on the SEG abstracts all the time. I feel like the last day of the abstract deadline, I feel like the website is always so slow because everybody's trying to submit everything. So try to do it, begin early, and try to do it maybe at least an hour before the deadline. So the student technical program grant application. So the first thing that's important here is to make sure that your paper was even accepted. Because if you didn't have an accepted paper, then you aren't going to receive, that's like an automatic disqualification. So what's important to note is that these grants aren't always an all-inclusive grant program. Sometimes you may just get some of your travel expenses funded, or you can get the entire trip funded. And expenses for this often include your airfare, you get food and your meals provided, you may get hotel, and then I believe it pays for your registration to the conference. I believe I've seen students only receive a registration grant, but not like all of the travel expenses. So there is definitely a range in what you can receive. So here you go. These are just some of the requirements. There's 3 essay questions. So this is the program where I referenced earlier, where they asked me like, what sort of change or suggestions do I have for the society? Like, what would I like to see? And that's where I talked about voting rights. So it's not at all related to my abstract at all. This technical program grant is more interested in you as a member, and basically are trying to see like how involved you are and what sort of ideas you can potentially bring to the table. Because not only do they have these funds for you to attend the meeting, they often have events for you at the annual meeting as well. Like I believe I attended a career networking event where I spoke to some of the more senior members who were in all sorts of different career paths within geophysics. And so it was really interesting to learn about the different careers, but the society as a whole just wants to help like shape all of the students and provide resources for them. And so here again, this says like they want your transcripts from the most recent 3 years. So again, if you need to provide your undergraduate transcripts, make sure you do that. Okay, the Near Surface Research Award. So I don't think the actual amount is listed online, but I believe it ranges from about $1,000 to $2,000 a year. And sometimes it's 1 student, sometimes it's 2 students. It entirely depends on the available funds in the Near Surface Endowment. So this application process will start in January. And so this requirement, or this research proposal, is a 2-page research proposal. So this is where it's important to be clear and concise and to the point with what you're trying to do with your research. And something that's really important in this as well is providing your budget. And so, like I mentioned earlier, I believe budgets can be difficult to think about. So in addition to the quality of your research proposal, it's what's important to granting agencies is they want to see how much you've thought out what the logistics are about your research project. So you have the proposal. Oftentimes you have to submit a research schedule over the course of X number of years, for example, to talk about how you plan to carry out your research experiments. And so you want to make sure that you're realistic with everything that you have going on. You want to make sure you're realistic with, say you have to send samples out to be tested to an external lab, make sure you're providing enough time for those samples to get back to you. If you need to obtain software or licensing, make sure you allow enough time for that sort of planning. Permitting for your field sites may be important. These are all important things to talk about in your schedule as well as your budget. important to know here is what's nice is that the SEG Near Surface Grant actually has a wiki page where you can actually look up all of the students who have received this grant. And then not only can you see a bio about each student, but you can see the abstract about their research project. So you don't get to read their full proposal, but you can at least see an abstract about what type of research they conducted. So some things that may go into a research budget that you may not have thought about, but are important to include. Everything I've seen online and what I've learned is that it's important to make sure you itemize everything. So don't just say lab costs $500. Break down those lab costs into what you're referring to. So they may be internal lab costs, internal such as at your research group or in your university, or external if you have to send samples out somewhere to be tested. Talk about what all of those costs are associated. This may be shipping costs. If you have to secure packaging materials for each of your samples, like test tubes or specific boxes, like core boxes, like make sure all of those expenses are itemized and listed out. Either you can list it out like by sample. So if you're going to be working with 7 cores, make sure you list out 7 cores and then each individual packaging material for each of those cores. Talk about your travel expenses. So mileage to and from if you're driving, fuel for your vehicles, hotel accommodation, airfare, meals, MI&E. You can refer straight to this website. Excuse me. If you're US based, there is government information about location-based MI&E costs, which are granted by federal agencies. They may not be granted by your university, but your university may even have their own breakdown of what those MI&E costs are. Experimental supplies. Do you need to rent any sort of geophysical equipment or geology equipment to conduct your research? Make sure you include not just the final cost of the rental, or don't even don't even guess. You can go on websites where you may think about renting that equipment, and they break it down for you by day of each instrument. So go and just honestly like copy paste that information. If you have so many days that you believe you'll be using that equipment, provide that in your budget deadline, break by day. And make sure you think about any extra days in case you need to ship that equipment. Shipping costs, again, costs for obtaining your samples. Construction materials. Are you going to need to build any infrastructure or shoring if you're doing test pits, for example? What are those material costs? And break those down as well. Time and labor for yourself and any sort of field assistance. Are you going to be bringing on an undergraduate student? Are you going to be bringing on a classmate? Those are sort of things that you can provide in your budget breakdown. And again, like I said, itemize everything. The detailedness of your budget is going to demonstrate how much you've thought out this research project. Basically, like how much thought you put into this. Is this an idea you just threw together last weekend? Maybe it is, but even if you did do that, show like what you've all thought about it, so that you can demonstrate it's something that's achievable to do throughout whatever course of the timeline that you've set. And so lastly, here are just some resources. So these are specifically off the SEG website. So there are web pages for each of the different granting programs. And Tyler Schwenk actually did a webinar recording on, he's the chair of the Travel Grant Committee. And so what's important to know is that the Travel Grant Committee does review applications that are more than just a travel grant. He actually, that committee is also responsible, I guess, for the Near Surface Award and some other grants within the SEG. So this is a link to the webinar that he did with another person talking about more tips and tricks specifically for SEG grants that the Travel Grant Committee oversees. And then these are just some articles by outside agencies like non-SEG agencies that give advice on how to formulate your research proposals. So if you're not familiar, so some of these may be catered specifically towards grants from their agencies, but they also do talk a lot about what goes into an abstract, like what more budget information, for example. The Geo Society or Geological Society of America has some information about budgeting. So just don't be afraid to look at other granting agencies to see what sort of resources they provide, because SCG may not have what you're looking for or may not have enough detail. So it never hurts to look at other, either the NSF, GSA, AGI, AGU, even federal agencies. You can often find advice on what goes into a research proposal. And sometimes there are even classes offered by universities that talk about how to write a grant, and those lecture materials may be available online. So do your research either both on your society that you're applying to, on your research project that you're trying to achieve, and then also just like how to write a grant. And some universities even have internal resources as well. So the Career Center may be helpful with that. Or your individual department or the school within your university may have some people who specialize in grant writing. Make sure to reach out to those people if you can and try to get some feedback, and make sure you provide enough time for those folks to get back to you with their comments and questions, because no one likes to have their time wasted, including ourselves, right? So give yourself and others enough time, and just best of luck. And if you get rejected, there's no shame in trying again. Unfortunately, a lot of us all get rejected more than we like to admit. I think I saw this quote online about a woman who on the same day she won the Nobel Prize, she had a research proposal rejected. So just because you're rejected in one area doesn't mean you're rejected in another. So yeah, best of luck. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Very insightful presentation, and you really give us details. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mary, the presenter, Dr. Sarah. My question here is that you said possibly if you have if you are asked to express like the need for that particular project in like 200 words, and you can be able to express yourself within 50 or 70 words, so no need to complete that particular 200 that it being said you should not complete. Or let me understand that, please.
Oh, so you're asking what happens if you have like a shorter response, I believe is what you're asking. I think that's a very difficult thing to think about, because I think there's often a specific reason for why the application programs are allowing you to have so much space to talk about whatever the specific question is, even if it's like your personal statement. So if it's something, say, like you said, if you have 1,000 words and you only use a couple hundred or 500 words, think about if you were reading that, if you were reading that as the reviewer, maybe you would ask, I feel like one of the first questions you would ask is, why didn't they write more? And so sometimes you may be selling yourself short by not expanding on anything. So I would say try to maybe expand upon certain things of yourself, and where you can. I know it's a very difficult part. I personally have been told that writing too short of an answer can also be detrimental to you. So it's a very difficult balance that you have to have. But I do worry that one of the first questions a grant reviewer would ask is why didn't they talk more? Because I think something we all know is that people in academia love to talk about themselves. And so I know it can be difficult for us younger students, for us younger career folks to talk about ourselves because we maybe haven't built up that confidence. But definitely try to at least hit at least half to maybe 75% of the word limit if you can, because you don't want to, I guess you don't want to leave the reviewer wondering what they're not talking about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Sarah, for the answer. And Mohammed, I hope that answered your question. So try as much as possible to exhaust the word count. So we have another hand raised, Farai Winner. Please, you can ask your question.
Okay, so my question is, as a student, a lower grade student, are there any research programs that I can pick up to, as since for Zimbabwe we are just starting for our geophysics at undergraduate? I was asking if there are other research programs where you can actually join into other groups research.
So the grants that SEG offers are for individual research projects that a student is trying to perform. They're not, I don't know of any resources for helping students find available research positions within other groups or other universities. Those might be more university dependent. But these are specific to, like, it's an individual project. So like a master's student or an undergraduate research project, it's a specific project that the student themselves is trying to conduct. So that doesn't, so what that means is that if you're within a group and maybe there's nobody within your group that is doing that research, you can apply to these programs to fund that research that maybe your university can't. I mentioned that there are equipment rentals available, and so you can rent equipment from different companies, and there are actually research grants from some of these companies that will provide you with a rental for free. Those are other scholarship opportunities, like I believe GSSI has a equipment rental grant program where you can essentially use their equipment for free. It requires another grant proposal, of course, but there are some opportunities like that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah, for the answer. I think we have some questions in the Q&A, and I'll just read one. Please, if you have your questions, just type it into the Q&A. That's where I will read them from, okay? So Salia asked, does one need to have obtained admission from a university before they apply for graduate scholarship?
That's a good question. So these programs specifically are for those currently enrolled in university programs. So say if you've already completed your undergraduate and you're applying to graduate programs, there are some specific programs that do allow you to apply. I think there's an NSF graduate program, which will actually, is like a huge grant that will provide you with like essentially your full funding for your graduate program. And you can bring that with you to the university. But these programs at SEG, I believe, all require you to be a currently enrolled student. So these are important questions to ask when you're looking at the different funding agencies. It will tell you specifically whether or not you need to be currently enrolled in the graduate program. So it is very grant dependent.
Okay, thank you so much. So I feel they could also reach out to the organization to ask, right, to know if they are eligible before they start applying.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, then thank you for the answer. The next one is Chidiogo Ibokwe. She said, could a recent graduate who is not yet enrolled, I think they are similar, who is not yet enrolled in a postgraduate program or affiliated with an industry be eligible for research grants or travel grants in the geosciences?
That's a great question. This is also, I believe, very dependent on the granting agency. So today I was talking specifically about student opportunities, but there are absolutely research programs for early career, for professors, for researchers, for scientists that don't require you to be enrolled. These SCG programs, again, like I said, that I talked about are specifically for students. I do not believe the SCG has non-student research grants, but there are several agencies outside of the SCG. I can only really speak to US-based granting agencies since that's where I have the most experience. So like the NSF, for example, the National Science Foundation. Your country may have a similar grant program that does not require you to be enrolled in a program. But they do allow industry professionals or professors and other academics to submit. So for example, I'm no longer a student, but my agency, my actual federal agency, has grant opportunities, internal grant agents, internal grant opportunities. So your own organization may have those, your own company, or your country, for example, or even other professional societies. Like I believe GSA, the Geological Society of America, they offer research grants for non-students. So it's just really important to look at what the requirements are of the grant program.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Sarah. Then we have another question here from Anonymous said, can we get a mentor that can put us through the research saga?
That's a great question. I think that's something we all want. I believe if there was a link put in the chat, there's a great program called Mentoring 365, which is available to all SCG members, whether you're a student or a non-student. And also if you're a member of some of the other partnering agencies, you can sign up to go through that mentor program. And you don't have to be a student to be a mentee or to request a mentor. Just letting you know, I can be mentored by anybody else. I just look through whatever the profiles are and just be upfront and clear about what type of guidance you're looking for. Definitely utilize that Mentoring 365 program. It is free with your membership. And it is a really great resource and tool. And it's a great platform. That's actually pretty easy to use in my opinion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah. So I have my own question.
Yeah.
There are two. So the first is in terms of number of pages for a CV or resume, and number of pages for cover letter, because there are some applications that, just like you said, that will not give you the number of pages. They will just say submit a PDF with a particular file size. So what number of pages do you recommend for CV and cover letter for some of these scholarship programs?
That's a great question. So I think one of the first things is to look and see whether or not it requires a resume or if it requires a CV. If it specifically says resume, that is often limited to 1 or 2 pages. If it's a CV, you can have it as long as you want. A CV is supposed to be an encapsulation of everything you've done over your career. So if it's only interested in the last 10 years, I guess you can cater your CV to only include information over the last 10 years. But a CV often is, I mean, my current CV is 10 pages long. So don't be afraid to put every publication, every report, every poster that you've done on that CV. I think as we move on in our career, it's important to include all that information as possible to demonstrate who we are as researchers, how established we are, and like what sort of research we've already done. For a cover letter, I think there's like almost an unsaid rule that cover letters should be no more than 2 pages. The granting agency should also specify how long of a cover letter, and if a cover letter is even necessary. So it's not always necessary. Make sure to look at what the program requires.
All right, thank you so much. So we have another question here.
Yeah.
Said, I don't know. Said, why does it take long to be matched with a mentor under Mentoring 365?
Oh, I am so sorry to that person who asked that question. I don't work for Mentoring 365. I am sorry that they're having that experience. I feel like it's very similar probably to the question of why doesn't my professor get back to me? And I think it has to do with the person that you're requesting information from. So I'm sorry, I can't really answer that directly. I would say that if you're not getting a response from a mentor, reach out to another person. If they don't have the time to answer your mentor request, they probably are not a good fit for you. And it's reflective of how much time they'd even have to be your mentor. So definitely try to reach out. I'm sorry it's been frustrating for you so far.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah. And we have another question said, how can one get postdoctoral fellowship grants in near surface geophysics as they are very limited opportunities?
Oh, that's a difficult question. It really comes down to, I think, what the quality of the proposal. It is so, our field is so competitive. And that's a very difficult question to answer. I'm very sorry. I think I've mentioned before too that sometimes it takes several applications before you can get one accepted. I have to find a new room in 2 minutes. I'm sorry. So I'm sorry, it's a very difficult question to answer. So I don't have a clear answer. I think it just takes time and experience.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, it's just time and experience that counts. So, okay, Chukunonso Ikechukwu, please, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
I said, is it every research that you wanted to carry out that you have the privilege to request for funding, or is there a specific research that requires funding?
Is there specific research that requires funding?
Right.
So I guess it depends on so I think this goes down to kind of what I talked about with the budget. Something we all need to think about is our own personal time costs money. So someone may be willing to volunteer to do work, but it's important to think about what those expenses are. So I would argue that nothing is free. Do you have a computer that you're working on to conduct your research? What's the cost of that computer? Do you need a new computer? Do you need Wi-Fi and internet for conducting your research? What's that going to cost? Do you need a space to conduct your research? Whether it's an office or a lab space? What sort of cost do that have for renting a space if necessary? These are things to think about. Like I know so say you work primarily on the laptop and you have you run a lot of numerical modeling. Is there time necessary for renting time on that cluster if you have to run high level modeling? What sort of expenses is that? But also most importantly is your time. What would your time cost to perform that research? So if you currently are a student, look at what your salary is and see if the research proposal can offset some of those salary costs. And also, just time for travel and costs for travel. Do you need to go anywhere? Do you need to buy any sort of laboratory supplies? These are things to think about. So I would argue there's no research that's free. Our time is not free, at least.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah. Thank you, Dr. Sarah, Martin Rupert, for joining us today. Thank you for the insightful presentation and answering all these questions. And thank you, everyone, for joining this SCG Near Surface Geophysics Subcommittee's webinar on how to apply for scholarships and grants. And we hope that you enjoyed and learned a lot today. So the recording will be sent. Just keep an eye out to also send us review what you think can be done better, and then keep an eye out for our next webinar. I'm sure you will learn a lot too. So thank you very much, Dr. Sarah, for joining us today. We sincerely appreciate you.
Thank you for having me. I hope this was helpful to everybody.